Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on. I don't know who will come up here to talk about the opera, but we're really excited. I know Dr. Lee's a little sick, but I can't speak to it as well as she could.
Yeah, I'm against my own advice. When you're sick with cold, you should stay home. But show must go on. So I'm going to be here, introduce our guests, composer Greg Hughes, who is a professor at PLU, Pacific Lutheran University, and which is really next door to us. He is Greg Hughes' composition, including works for orchestra, band, choir, voice, and chamber ensembles, and two previous operas, including the 1991 Song from the Cedar House about Native American white interactions in the Puget Sound region, and the Fairy Jade Cai Yan, a libretto by yours truly here, based upon the life of a historical Han Dynasty Chinese woman, which premiered at PLU in 2016. He also composed the score for a full-length musical theater show, The Blooming Season, based upon traditional Chinese opera plot, which premiered in the Evergreen State College in 2004. And with the director sitting in the audience, Rose Zhan, a professor from Evergreen Olympia campus. And the lyric was wrote by a student, Nick McCall. Greg Hughes is a member of the Pacific Lutheran University Chinese Study Program for many years. Hughes has done research on Chinese music, instruments, and the use of Chinese music technique applied to Western instruments, and has a list of compositions based upon Chinese ideas from poetry and painting to history and philosophy. I give you Greg Hughes.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lee. I know you as Zhang, my collaborator in a variety of projects. I'm delighted to see several other friends of mine from Evergreen faculty here, as well as all of you. So I teach at PLU, just 5 miles down the road towards Olympia, towards your direction. And there we have quite a substantial classical music department. We also have a jazz department, but I would say what we're mostly known for is classical music. That is certainly what I am most known for as a composer, although I love dabbling in songwriting and some music for dance and various other kinds of things as well. But we're here essentially to tell you about a project, a specific project that we are working on together here, and to share with you a couple of the songs from that, and also to tell you how this came to be and how it fits into a larger sort of social, political, social justice kind of context, and ultimately to engage with you in, I suppose, a conversation about what you think about this. A lot of people would say, opera, that's kind of remote. That's long ago, it's far away, it's European. What does that have to do with anything with me or with Tacoma? I guess Zhang and I both feel that opera is one of a whole set of artistic possibilities with which people can address the most serious topics that there are. And there have been operas addressing everything from nuclear annihilation to rape to our imprisoned population. I mean, opera can and does handle pretty much any topic that it chooses to do so. I'm going to start by laying a somewhat larger context, and then I'm going to pass it back to Professor Lee to tell about her own research. The larger context is that Tacoma, of course, is the name of the city was given to the method by which Chinese were excluded from not just Tacoma, but a variety of cities on the West Coast back in the 1880s. And in 1885, when the mayor of Tacoma led a group of officials, as well as a kind of a mob of citizens, to drive the Chinese out of Tacoma at gunpoint, that became known as the Tacoma method. and was sort of shared widely amongst what we would now call white supremacist groups around the country who had similar designs on their Chinese populations. Tacoma in the early 1990s sort of rediscovered this history. And a group of citizens approached the city council and the mayor and said, we should do something about this. And they formed what became known as the Chinese Reconciliation Project Foundation. And this foundation is still going strong. I'm a board member. It has very strong support from the Tacoma City Council, from the Tacoma mayor, from all kinds of business people around Tacoma. With all of their help and with the help of the local city, the county, the state, and even some federal grants, they have managed to build a Chinese park down on the Tacoma waterfront. How many people have been to that Chinese park? Great, okay. And if you didn't even know it was there, go check it out. It's just on this side of Old Town. It's sort of hidden away, but it's as close as the foundation could find to a spot that is just about where the Chinese community lived back in the 1880s. So I just want to let you know there is a website, and if you simply search for Tacoma Chinese Park, very simple, you will come up with the Chinese Reconciliation Project Foundation website. There's all kinds of resources there, there's all kinds of links there, and you can sort of read more about the general context. Anyway, I think it was 2014 perhaps, 2013 perhaps, the board, of which I am a member, held a kind of a luncheon to get people from the Tacoma community to come and consider donating to what was then the still new Tacoma Moon Festival, a festival that is held at the Tacoma Chinese Park. At that, one of the attendees was Noel Corin, who was new in Tacoma. He's the head of Tacoma Opera. And he'd never heard this story before. Like so many people, he'd never heard this story from Tacoma's history. And he said, wow, this ought to be an opera or something. And he called a number of us together, and I said, I would love to take this on, even if I'm not the composer. I would love to help sort of make this happen in some way, shape, or form. Well, here we are a number of years later, and we have now come to the place where we actually have something to show and something to listen to. The process of composing the opera is ongoing. It's not done yet. But we have a series of about 4 or 5 pieces that are pretty much done, and we're going to do 2 of them for you today, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that later. So that's the larger context. I'm going to pass it back now to Dr. Lee to tell you about her process.
Thank you. So in 2013, I believe, that's 4 years ago, yeah, and about this time, maybe a little early in the late fall, and Greg all of a sudden sent me an email, we're working on something else, and are you interested in research to be part of this project? So, so we meet, and then I know nothing, except I heard about this when I come to teach in Tacoma. People say, wow, you go to Tacoma, that's a city you should be avoiding, and they have a history there. And I then, from what on this campus exposed to the Pacific Northwest history, and I'm aware of the 1885 incidents, but I don't know. I assume it's just people hate the Chinese, just the race thing, and they don't understand whatever the situation is, it's long past. But doing an opera, for me, is first, I want to know who are these Chinese people, because I don't have intrinsic knowledge about who these people are, except I'm from the same ancestral home. But so for me, it's starting reading about it, and before I can think about which direction the opera goes. Let me see if it works. So, I mean, as a research scientist, I start with books, right? And so way I read this chapter, I think most of you has read in Pacific Sound, Puget Sound by Maury Morgan in the chapter Chinese Must Go. That chapter I read at least 5, 6 times, and trying to figure out different parties that involved in the final events. And then Greg sent me, actually both books suggested by Greg, is the Straw Hat and Sandals and Stills, and by a local historian. And I think the book is never been formally published. It is commissioned in 1977 by Tacoma in terms of talking about the history of Tacoma and mainly the Chinese residents at that time, how they contribute to the creation of the city of Tacoma and how they ended up being driven away. And another book, very informative and gave me a lot of historical documents, is Driven Out, which is come up about the forgotten war about the Chinese Association, Chinese Americans. And this book is collecting not just the fact in Tacoma, but all over North America. And why they came about, how they driven out, how they fare in the new country, and what are was their roles in the general economy at that time. Very informative, and especially in terms of it provides a lot of links as well as photocopies of classical historical documentation. And from that book, the community emerged to me as individuals rather than just a whole group of nameless people been doing this and then they're driven out. And what's most informative for me personally as a poet, emotionally, is this, the Ganser's photographies. And he is a Westerner, was living in late 19th century, early 20th century. He came from Germany, I believe, and amateur photographer at the first, and then become dedicated photography for throughout his life. He lived in San Francisco, Chinatown around the 1880s, and took hundreds of thousands of photographs, black and white, of all the people living in Chinatown. He was fascinated by the culture, exoticness, as well as the social interaction, the colors, the aromas, and all that. So left a whole bunch of photographs, black and white photographs, and which majority of them was destroyed in the San Francisco big fire, burned down the whole Chinatown, and including his apartment, attic apartment in Chinatown. And one of his friends after the fire went to his apartment, rescued about 600 of the natives, and many of them are damaged. So from those images, and there are hello, yeah. And then lastly is Old Chinatown. It's a relatively new book, which I really just found it's fascinating. Is it including a lot of oil paintings done by the contemporary of the Tacoma residents, of Chinese residents at that time. But it was in the major Chinatown on the West Coast is San Francisco Chinatown. But it was done by a couple of Westerners, and then they showed me all of a sudden the black and white images become colorful, and the whole thing become real. So the question as a writer, first of all, we all heard of the Transcontinental Railroad building, right? And last week we were in Tacoma Art Museum looking at the artists tracing all the railroad construction. So the question is, what did they go after? These are the photographs from 1860s, and some of the Chinese workmen building the railroad. Very proud workmen, but the question is, where did they go afterwards? So the images from Ganser's, as I mentioned, in San Francisco in 1980s, I wonder if you can really It's kind of dark. The image on the left, I'm kind of familiar with. Chinatown, dingy, all the men are dressed up in the same kind of gray, dark color suits, hats, mingling around. And they moved from the countryside where they built railroad into Chinatown, which is really also, it's almost like a neighborhood, what do you call that, ghetto. That's literally ghetto, because at that time, there are gates around it. People cannot go, Chinese people usually cannot go out unless you have to come in at the middle of the night, before middle of the night. So it's like a ghetto, and Chinatown is a place Westerner can come in during the day and to have exotic experience, but most of Chinese people stay within. They cannot rent house outside. So Chinatown in San Francisco was built up and down so to accommodating all the workmen come in after the railroad finished. And the picture on the right is on your, how do I say this, on the left, is a different image, and that's from Ganser's book. You can see it's probably on a New Year's Day. Everybody's dressed in a very fancy outfit, and a proud father, and with two proud little boys. And which is, for some reason at that time, when I see this, and I saw my whole idea of all those long time ago community changed. And I thought, wow, their family life here. There are people living dignified rather than just the coolies and those people hunched back on the cartoons you see. This is some image, some kind of a community I want to research more, to look into it, to see who are these people. So then Ganser's image from old Chinatown in San Francisco, you see the mother with three little girls and boys. And you see on the side, the street vendors, and you still, all the fresh vegetables, you still see it in Chinatown, they're displayed. And on this side, young man seems always idling and standing around looking. And so I thought, oh, maybe that's what happened there, right? So, I mean, you as a researcher, historical research, you get your clues from different places. And then I see this formal family portrait, and you can see the attire is clearly the late 19th century, the Qing Dynasty styles, and in silk, heavy garments. And this is a family of 5 children, possibly, and they were fashionable. They go to the photo studios at that time. It's fashionable to have family portraits. They were displaying themselves in their best. So I said, that's beyond the workman, there are other elements of the communities, of Chinese community in America. And of course, on the same photo album, you will see someone really down on their luck. And clearly a beggar or someone who is sitting there with his sticks and cans for monies, and then a sack. And later on, in a different incidents, as I was teaching with Peter Baccio on early Asian American literature, and I found this collection of anthology of San Francisco, Chinatown, poetry anthology collected during the same period. And this guy's photograph is on the cover. Of all the fun, delicate poetry was written, and the photography chose a beggar sitting on the cover of the anthology. So my original impression of the Chinese community is like that. It's sitting on the street, like ask for handout. And my idea changed through this process of looking at the historical image. But then turned out there's a backstory of that particular man. He has a name, and everybody know who he is in San Francisco, Chinatown. He was given the job of collecting all the loose papers discarded on the street. Because at the end of 19th century, Chinese society is before the revolution, still very much of a Confucian dominant society. I believe everything has words written on it, need to be collected and burned in a special altar, because words are something handed to us from our ancestors. Respect words is part of respect our ancestor. So he is the one who go around the street collecting all the discarded papers that has words on them and send them to the community oven to get it incinerated. So the editor of the anthology defend his position of choosing this image. He said, I'm doing the same thing, all the written I'm collecting. Rather than denigrating Chinese society, it is, I'm the collector of all the written words. So I said, oh, okay, history can be really interesting. And even one image, you can read a lot of things into it. So, so he's probably a person, as well as the whole family in the Qing Dynasty attire, is a testimony for change, as well as testimony for that historical period when old traditions, old beliefs still very much of the fabric of the community. So with that, this is later, I start writing about this opera. This is later, I found this, it's such a bad, it's my handiwork shooting from a book, from one of the last books I was reading. So these pictures is by Worth. Theodore Worth, these paintings was painted in 1885 to 1889 during that same period. So on the left is showing a banquet in a Chinese restaurant. So, and that image tell me clearly you can see the social stratification, right? So you have the gentleman in the green silk robe, and there's a little boy, the image is dark. The little boy standing there also equally dressed in silk from top to bottom, and has kind of purplish color to it. And clearly, and the gentleman in green robes handing him a toy in his hands. And at the back, you see the waiter standing in a very plain clothes with aprons trying to serve. And the back is a musician. So when I see it, I say, Greg, that's a musician. There is a musician entertaining and has instruments, probably a sanxian, playing at the back to entertaining as the meal going on. Right, and the decoration, the colorful decoration, saying, wow, they really bring the end of Qing Dynasty's decoration, ornate coloring into this country. And on the other hand, the lamp is Western style lamp, was kind of all combination. So it gave me the idea of this community from Canton province. They have a lot of the old Chinese style, and in the meantime, exposed to the Western culture. So this image speaks a lot to me. And on the right is, you see the mother again, dressed in the period robe and with two of her kids. And on a New Year's Day, the artist was specific. It's a New Year's Day, and they're buying flowers. It's like in southern China, New Year's associated beyond food is a lot of flower and decoration and celebration. And the image of the society, of the community become fuller as the year goes by while I'm working on this. So so as to the Chinese character in the opera, so I choose Mr., the men's side of character, Mr. and Mrs. May. And if I can, how do I do this now? Shrink this? No.
Trying to go to that link?
Yeah, how can I shrink this? No.
Any Mac people in the house?
Just last slide. I want to show these two characters. There's a link. I couldn't see the page. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so this is a page from that Chinese Driven Out. This is a court document by Lang Mei, and this was filed after Davis filed in June 3rd, 1886. And it shows that he described in his first person voice exactly what happened that day. And mentioning all the people, in count of time, I'm not going to go to the details, but I can post it. So what happened that day, and especially at this paragraph, I don't know if you can see it, he's talking about his wife, was driven crazy on that day when people broke into his home and broke windows, broke doors, and the mobs from Tacoma and dragged his wife out of the house. And his wife refused to go. His wife saying, this is my home, I don't want to go. So they dragged him out, and she went mad. And she started using any weapon, was hatching at people, and lost his sense. So Mr. May was commenting on that. So this is where the two character part of the opera in the Chinese community side of the story started, Mrs. May and Mr. May. And then at the end of the opera, it ends in a way that, that is reacting that day of November 3rd in 1885 when the Chinese community were driven out. And okay, I think I'll just end here. And on the other side of the token, Greg probably will talk a little more, is the Western side of the story, which the book Chinese Must Go will give you a lot of details, because 1885 is not that far away. So there are newspapers, documentations can be found. And a little tricky to find the Chinese side of the story except this court paper.
It's not that one, so close that one out. It should be, yes, that one. Yes, right. All right. In preparation for bringing our singers up here, I'm going to steal one of these chairs, and I think we'll move our singers off to the side a little bit so that they're not blocking the screen for you. Just one is fine, I think, yeah. You guys can move this as you like when you come up. All right, well, obviously I could talk for days about writing an opera. I'm not going to do that. But I do want to just give you a little heads up what to listen for when you hear these two songs. The first one is an aria by Jakob Weissbach. He was the mayor of Tacoma. He had only been in the US for maybe 10 years. He had been a revolutionary, a young revolutionary, a labor organizer, Marxist, with Marx and Engels in the famous 1848 uprisings in Germany. And like so many revolutionaries, he had had to flee because they cracked down on those riots and demonstrations. And surprisingly enough, he had gone to China. So he actually knew China quite well. Chinese people, he'd been probably in Canton, one of those ports that was opened up by force by the Westerners. And then he had come to the US, and he had settled in Kansas, where he had a homestead, and probably ran a store, and he seems to have had a bit of a political career. He seems to have been like a legislator in the state legislature or something, and then he decided to come west to Tacoma. So when he arrived here, he'd only been in town for a year or two when he was elected mayor, which seems a little odd, but people probably thought, well, he's had political experience. He'd make a good mayor. But of course, as you probably know, there was a serious recession at that time. So jobs were scarce, money was scarce. The Chinese had arrived with the railroad and had stuck around, and now they were lumber people, they were digging coal, they were building auxiliary rail lines up to Seattle, they were farming, helping Ezra Meeker grow hops out there in Puyallup, making beer and whatever. So they were doing all kinds of things, and some of them, of course, like Lum May that we just talked about, and one of his colleagues, Mr. Lee, were serious business people with money, with capital. They employed people, they ran businesses. They had fairly substantial establishments, both houses and stores and things. So the two arias you're going to hear today, the first one, aria just means song in Italian, so it's one of the songs of an opera. And the first one you're going to hear is Mayor Weissbach. And he is heading off to a meeting. And he's getting his clothes on. And he's something like 60 years old at this point. He's been doing this kind of labor agitation for a long time. He thinks of himself as doing history's mission, right? We're heading towards some sort of a revolution of some kind, a labor revolution. And so labor activism like this is the way to go. He thinks of the Chinese as scabs, scab labor brought in by capitalists, right? So he does not see the Chinese simply in ethnic terms. He sees them in economic terms as a threat, not just that he's worried that there are a lot of Chinese and they all might come here. He is worried about that. He's also worried that they are willing to work harder, longer, and cheaper. And that's going to drive the wages of all working people down, and therefore they must all go. So it's important to recognize that somebody who goes down in history pretty conveniently as a villain, in his own mind has his own reasons for doing what he's doing. Some of it is just flat out racism, of course. Some of it is economics. Some of it is what he sees as almost a divine mission to build a proper society for American working people. So when I took all that into account, I decided that I should use a famous labor organizing song from the period. It's called the Internationale, and it is still performed regularly around the world at sort of socialist rallies, this kind of thing. It's sort of the international working people anthem. I took that song, you will hear it, it sounds like a march, and I built my own song on top of it. So as Mayor Weissbach is getting ready to sing, as he's getting ready to go out to join this rally, he's first of all saying to himself, oh my God, I'm old, I'm tired, do I really have it in me to do this again? But he's also then hearing his inspiration, which is this song that is all about the international labor movement, right? And that is his justification for doing what he's doing. Okay, so now I'm going to go into narrator mode, and sorry, get myself organized here. All right, Mayor Weissbach, take your place. The scene is the new city of Tacoma in 1885, with its mud streets, wooden buildings, sawmills, railroad terminus, and burgeoning port along the foot of the bluff. In Act 1, the leaders of the Chinese community, general store owner Mr. Lum Mei and his wife, and landlord, labor contractor, and farm owner Mr. Sing Li and his wife, host in February a Chinese New Year party for the leaders of the white community, fellow store owner and mayor Jakob Weisbach, Judge James Wickersham, and others. But by Act 2 of the opera, now in October and November 1885, Mayor Weisbach has organized the town to expel all Chinese from Tacoma. And on November 3, the factory whistle blows, the white mob forms with guns and clubs, and the Chinese are forced outside their homes and marched in driving rain to the railroad station in South Tacoma, where they are forced to board trains south to Vancouver. It is Washington's second act of ethnic cleansing, after the forced removal of the native peoples to the so-called reservations 30 years earlier in the 1850s. In this aria, Mayor Weisbach, himself an immigrant from Germany and most recently a new arrival from a business and political career in Kansas, prepares himself to address a meeting at the Alpha Opera House, in which he will unveil his plan to ethnically cleanse Tacoma of its Chinese population. He thinks back to his youth as a labor organizer in the 1848 anti-monarchist uprisings in Europe and wonders if he still has the energy for yet another battle. But as he thinks of the great struggle of labor against capital, he hears in his mind the call of the Internationale, the great international labor anthem, and he puts on his coat for action.
Battle commences, old timer. Do you still have it in you? Do you still have it in you? From Borba to Madras, settlement in a watery area burns on the west bank of the Rhine. The oldest jewel in all of Europe, to Tacoma, mother of waters, the newest star in the galaxy of civilization. Liberty, equality, and fraternity, the noble banner of humanity, held firmly above my head. Always this the final struggle. Let us lead our work apace, and tomorrow's international will be the human race. In this crusade, we engage a united capital on this course, and a government that cares more to expand overseas markets and profits for the better elements than for the working man. A hard fight, a good fight. Chains, prison, and exile for my reward. Now the cries of the Chinamen will be my burden. I am glad to bear for sacrificial offering surely. Yet I am not afraid, there must be justice, eternal justice for my people and for my town. The trumpets blow, legs unfurled, you see Tacoma, the old revolutionary is ready to serve. This the final struggle. Let us lead our work apace. Und tomorrow's International will be the human race.
By late morning, the mob has reached the house of store owner Lum May on the waterfront where Pacific Avenue slopes down to the railroad tracks and the shore. This is where many Chinese live and have their own community, complete with temple and shrine. The mob raids the storehouse where Mr. May keeps his inventory, breaking down the door with their clubs and helping themselves to whatever they like. They then pound on the door of the house and demand that the May family emerge. Mrs. May is upstairs with her 2 children, cowering in terror and disbelief. She sings to the city she thought would be her home and that of her children.
From toys built by billions, Chinaman's hands, you grew into an observant Chinatown, a place we called home. We labored, we built, I poured tea to welcome all. Oh, Tacoma, mother of waters. Oh, Tacoma, I poured tea little cup. Oh, Tacoma, I poured tea for you. Why envy my little cup?
Let me introduce you to Mia Higashiyama, who just graduated from PLU and is now auditioning for all kinds of fancy, famous things, graduate schools, festivals, summer schools, and she's going to be a star one of these days. So keep your eye on Mia. And Josh Carlisle is a more or less junior at PLU, right? And also heading in an opera career direction, and obviously has this fabulous tenor voice. If you're not familiar with voice types, Mia is what we call a mezzo-soprano. If you sang in choir, she's an alto. And Josh is a tenor. One of the things we try to keep in mind when we write operas, of course, is to make sure that we have a variety of vocal types, because you don't want to hear one kind of voice sing the whole opera. So we made sure that we have characters that are soprano, alto, tenor, bass, etc. There's a choir as well, sort of a choir of townspeople that will be part of the music of this thing. Just a couple more comments from me, and then I think we'll open it up to you guys for comments or reactions or whatever. As I'm thinking about composing the music for this, I'm of course dealing with two simultaneous cultures. One is the white culture, and they need a music that sounds like them. And I figured, out here in Tacoma, you don't have symphony orchestras yet. You might have a fiddle. You might have a guitar and a banjo. There's probably a church, a little pedal pump organ, probably no electricity yet. There's a little pedal pump organ in various churches. There are pianos in some people's parlors, if they're rich enough to have brought one, around the horn or maybe on the train. But instruments are going to be sort of folk-like. And so the ensemble that I've chosen gives me a variety of options for those kinds of things. And on the Chinese side, again, the Chinese community, despite having a fairly substantial community here with all of the things that they needed, they are not bringing their fancy instruments either, quite yet. And so these would be portable, light, inexpensive instruments that they would have. So Professor Lee mentioned something called a sanquan, that means a three-string. It sounds a lot like a banjo. So lucky for me, I get to hire one banjo player for the orchestra who gets to play banjo music for the white people and sanquan people for the Chinese people. Similarly, I'm going to have a little pedal organ, and in its lower range, it can sound sort of like a church organ, and its upper range, it can sound like another Chinese folk instrument called a sheng, which is a little mouth organ. So, this is part of the fun, I suppose you'd say, even on kind of a grim topic like this. You can have a ton of fun coming up with clever solutions to your problems of needing to somehow make these people's music sound like them at that time. So you can do an enormous amount of research on Cantonese folk music of the day, Cantonese opera music, music that Mrs. May might have grown up knowing before she moved to Tacoma. And similarly, what kinds of songs would Jakob Weisbach be aware of? Labor songs, of course, but folk songs, all kinds of things. So I've got a scene where, while the adults are, of course, in the middle of essentially ethnic cleansing, I'm going to have a scene where children are discovering that a banjo and a sanquan sound really similar, and they're going to trade folk songs back and forth to each other. Right? So kids are not yet old enough to have thought about ethnic cleansing. They're just kids. And so these are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about as a composer, coming right off of Professor Lee's libretto, her script for me. Maybe I'll pass the mic to Mia first and just ask her if she has anything she wants to say about singing either this song or just kind of how you prepare to be an opera person on stage in general.
Hi, thank you so much for allowing us to be here this morning and perform for you all. Such a joy. Pardon my voice, slightly recovering from a cold. But yeah, so for me, when I was asked to do this project, we originally kind of started this, Josh and I recorded these arias in the summer, which was super, super fun, and I think a new experience for us both. For me, so I am half Japanese. My dad is full Japanese and my mom is American. And my first sort of exposure actually to the extreme injustice that was going on within different, Asian communities and beyond was when I actually saw this opera at Seattle Opera, and I'm completely blanking on the name right now, but it only showed a few nights, and it was all about the Japanese internment camp. So obviously a little bit different than this, but for me as someone, that's part of my identity, and so when Dr. Utes asked me to do this project, that's actually kind of the first thing I thought of when I was sort of diving into Mrs. May, is that, yes, I have not quite experienced, what these people have, but generations that I come from have experienced similar things. And so for me, singing this aria was sort of difficult at first because, I don't have the exact experience to pull from. As an actress and a singer, I pull from all sorts of things that have happened in my life to, allow the extreme emotions Mrs. May has for, obvious reasons. So for me, it's really been an honor to do this project because I think there's a lot of communities, and I would say especially the Asian communities, that are not recognized enough or talked about enough, the sort of injustice that went on. I mean, the Japanese internment camps, it's just horrific. So one of the reasons I love to sing so much is because I believe that music has a lot of power in our world. And, in the last couple years, not to get all political, but in the last couple, just this year, our world has experienced so much violence and so much racial injustice, identity injustice, social injustice. And so for me, it's a sort of cathartic, and I feel that us, being able to participate this, and Dr. Utes, who has written this music, I think this has the potential to really not only raise awareness for these sorts of issues, but the only way that we can sort of prevent them in the future is by talking about it, and what better way to do that than in an environment that unites us, which is music.
So not exactly sure how to follow that up. That was really well said. I think the biggest piece of this to me has been, how do I inhabit this character? Because like when Mia said originally, we were originally just asked to record these, which was a ton of fun. And beyond the fact that aria is hard, it's not easy. Both of them are pretty difficult. But besides that fact, it's really hard to evoke the emotion of somebody that you disagree with so much, because a lot of the times in opera and in acting and anytime you're on stage, really, you're trying to inhabit that character, trying to understand where they're coming from, what they're experiencing, and try and inhabit those emotions. And it's really hard for me to inhabit the emotions of a racist, somebody who was pro-ethnic cleansing, a socialist, all of these things that, I personally don't have a lot of experience with, don't agree with, etc. So I think the biggest challenge for me as an actor is, how do I get up there and do a convincing, how do you get up there and make people hate you, basically? How do you get up there and perform an aria that nobody agrees with, but still do it well? So I find that super interesting. And just like Mia was saying about raising awareness for this topic, like I've grown up in the Tacoma area. I'm actually from Puyallup, but I've grown up in this area my entire life. And, especially with the internment camps and the fair being right there. I went to junior high school a block from the fair, and it's still not something that's talked about a lot. So I think that what Dr. Utes and Jong-ar are doing is super impressive, important to raise awareness for these issues, because like I was aware of those things, of the ethnic cleansing, of removing, getting the Chinese out of Tacoma and the Reconciliation Project, but I wasn't really well versed in it. I kind of just knew that it happened. So now I think through this music, like Mia was saying, through a universal language that is music, coming to understand just what these people went through, understanding why this happened, how we can prevent it in the future, it's been a huge honor for me to be a part of.
So we're basically done, and we would love to hear from you. Anybody want it? Yes.
Hi, Can you summarize the plot for us? Because we have a sense of these two arias.
Sure.
And we have a sense of the background and the context. But what's the story arc?
Yeah, good. First of all, there's a prelude, which is largely just instrumental and may have some vocal stuff in it, but it's largely an instrumental sort of overture, you might say, and it has probably a slideshow of some kind in the back. And then Act 1 is essentially in the spring. We see this dinner party hosted by the Chinese community, and we really get inside a Chinese family. They're all waiting for the sun to rise on New Year's morning and singing about good fortune, and it's going to be a great year. And then the two couples sort of discussing with each other how business is going and what's going on in China, and we get a sense that they are very connected to the larger world. They're connected via business, via culture, via associations that hold Chinese people together between Seattle and Tacoma and San Francisco and Portland. And, so they're very, very aware, connected people. Then the white people sort of enter this scene at this dinner party, and all kinds of faux pas happen and racist comments are made. And so we get a sense of these intruders into this otherwise harmonious society. And then Act 2 is where, of course, there's a meeting at the Opera House. Mayor Weissbach goes off too, and the white mob is planning. There are also white people who are very much against this, including Ezra Meeker, one of the founders of Puyallup. There is a Catholic priest named Father Hylebos, for whom the Hylebos Waterway down here is named. There's a Protestant minister who lectures his parishioners in church, don't do this, and they all leave, and he gets himself a pair of pistols because he thinks they're coming after him. I mean, this is really hot times in Tacoma, and we see all this. And then, of course, we get to the final mob scene, and we see all this happening, and that's when Mrs. May then sings her song, which we just saw. It will be quite violent. I mean, quite dangerous sounding in terms of the music. Lots of drums pounding and things sort of smashing and breaking. And so Mrs. May literally loses her mind. We know this from the testimony that she literally sort of enters a different space, whatever that is. And in this opera, what Professor Lee has written is that we sort of go inside her mind, and in her mind, she is not mad at all. In her mind, she is cursing the city of Tacoma. That until the city of Tacoma rectifies this wrong, Tacoma will never prosper. And that's where it ends. Which is maybe why Seattle became the big city and not Tacoma. Who knows, right? Good question. Thanks for asking that. Other comments from any of you? Yes.
I have been kind of haunted by this subject, and thank you guys for doing this. This again, agreed, this is such an important subject, but I remember when last time you mentioned this to me, Zhang, I was thinking, wow, this is so depressing. So it almost feels now, according to your description, it's quite depressing. Is there any hope? I mean, should we glean any hope from this opera? What is the point of the opera if it doesn't provide any glimpse of hope?
That's a great question. Opera is famously tragic. There are a lot of tragic operas where the hero or heroine end up dead on the floor singing one last aria, curtain comes down, audience jumps to his feet and goes, yay! So, I mean, I think the fact that this opera is about something that is not only very local and not that long ago, but in fact that we're writing it at this very moment in American history when we're suddenly surrounded by Mayor Weissbach's sort of coming back out very publicly and creating similar sorts of situations. It is timely in a scary sort of way. I think absolutely musically it is my job as a composer to somehow give us a sense that the world does not end badly. Right? Somehow or other, there has to be somewhere to go after the last scene. And that will be part of my job as a composer, I think. I had to do the same thing with the previous opera, which we did a year ago, where things end up kind of sad, but somehow there's hope, and one has to take the time sometimes to sort of create in the audience, so you're sort of through this catharsis, and then there has to be something where we've got a place to go. Yeah. Yes.
Kind of piggybacking off of that, I was wondering what kind of parallels you could draw from what we're doing to immigrant populations, especially with the GEO Group's presence in Tacoma at the Northwest Detention Center.
Yeah. Unpack that for me just a little bit more. Where would you like me to go with that?
So you've been researching the removal of immigrants, in this case Chinese, and at this very moment we have the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, which removes immigrants or, you know, detains them for however long. So I'm just wondering, in researching history so that it doesn't repeat itself, what statement will you be making any statement about the presence of that, and what will it be?
Yes. We actually had another writer involved who was sort of primarily concerned with that, I think, taking this story and using it as a stepping stone to very contemporary events. That has turned into another project because he wanted to go a substantially different direction, and it couldn't be both things at once. So this is kind of the historical piece, and that will be more of the contemporary piece, I think. But we do have some ideas. We need to run this past the Puyallup tribe, but we have an idea that maybe as sort of silent witnesses on both sides of the stage watching some or all of this opera could in fact be native peoples, just standing there watching all of these immigrants do this to each other on their land, right? There's also the possibility during the prelude and maybe again at the end of having images from the contemporary world of that facility, of just immigrant faces, communities, maybe people around here in Tacoma, maybe even slides of places we know around here in Tacoma where, you know, people live. There are people in Tacoma literally hiding, right? And so to sort of bring that back around so that, you know, the final message is not just that there's hope, because I'm not sure those people think there's a whole lot of hope. You know, there's a message that simply that we are here, right? We can't do anything about that back then. That was then, it's gone. Water under the bridge. But we can acknowledge what happened and we can see the present reflected in the past. And we can say to ourselves, oh my gosh, I am Mayor Weisbach. What am I going to do? Am I going to join the mob? Or am I going to join Ezra Meeker? Right? So these are the kinds of things that I think are going to have to somehow come out as I sort of get deeper into it. But absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and also I think when we presented this opera in the contemporary setting, without the librettist or the composer talking about the connections with contemporary, the audience will make the connection, right? And how do we share job opportunities? I mean, a lot of the mob there hate the Chinese because they think they take away the job. When Tacoma only has 6,000 people, they think the Chinese take off their job. But now we have 200,000 in Tacoma now. And it's the same thing. Can we share our job with the new immigrants? They come in because whatever good life they're searching here, can we share? So I think the audience, when they see what's happening on the stage, would reflect on themselves and on our own judgment. Why I feel uneasy when there's newcomer comes into my backyard, right? That's the question we hope people will think. And then the American Indian idea, Native American tribal people, at the beginning, at the end, standing on the stage, not talking, because so far they haven't said anything in words, but they are the original owner, all of us, including the Chinese, they are newcomers. And so how are we deal with that? And that is a question. I guess that's the hope, or that is trouble. It's the same thing, that we need to continue reflect and thinking about that, challenge our own humanities, right? Dr. Shepard.
Oh, okay. Excuse me. This is not a question, it's actually just an observation. I find it, and I wish I could think of the word right at the moment, but you're doing an opera, if you will, about something that happened that actually, if you will, started place in an opera house so many years ago. And I just find that to be, kind of telling that this opera, where, if you will, the opera house, which was supposed to be for something so grand and something so wonderful, ended up being for starting something that was so evil and so ugly, and now we have an opera that talks about what happened at the opera house.
Thank you for that comment. That's exactly what I feel. Thank you. And to feel justified, there has to be an opera to write it.
There are an awful lot of painful ironies in this history. Yeah. Yes.
Thank everybody for providing the opportunity for those of us from Olympia to come up. Thank you so much for doing that. Someone who's ignorant of your process, could you tell us a little more about that in terms of where you are in the writing and the production, where it will be produced, when it will be produced, et cetera?
It's really at the beginning, and I think the libretto is done, and as done as I can. And then right now the stage is, Greg is doing the composition, which is, it's much more intensive. And so we don't know the production. This is our preliminary production. A second time, actually, 2 of them, we have been doing this. And so Greg has some ideas to take the scene, a few songs, tour around the state, and to see if we can generate some interest. People from different resources can support this project to make it into a production.
In terms of my process, I've shared some things about the things I think about and how I operate kind of at a conceptual level. Composing classical music is a somewhat time-consuming process, and I sit all by myself at my piano and at my computer, and I generate stuff and I get rid of it and I generate more stuff, and then something clicks. And if there are songwriters in the house, probably some of you are musicians and write songs, you know the process. You go through various drafts, you try things out, and finally you feel like, I'm on to something, and something takes off. The aha moment for Josh's aria was when I suddenly thought about the Internationale, a song which, by the way, I love. It's a gorgeous march, and I'm all about that worker movement, but it was, again, a painful irony to me to realize that the kind of the labor movement that I grew up idolizing was in fact in charge of this awful project. So it just goes to show, the world is hopelessly complicated. There aren't just good guys and bad guys. And so the music somehow has to reflect that complexity. It's really easy to create cartoon characters, right? That totally bad, totally good. I know how to write bad guy music and good guy music, but that's dumb, right? And you guys are way too smart for that. That's Saturday morning cartoon stuff. But adult music has to be more complex than that. So, there are all kinds of places. I would love to take each of these arias apart for you and show you a place where I chose a B flat instead of a B natural because I wanted a minor 4 chord there instead of a major 4 chord, because on that particular word, I wanted it to go into shadow a little bit. This kind of thing is just, that's my process, and there's an awful lot of words in this thing, and we hope the whole thing is going to be, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours long, so that's a lot of music. So it takes a while to write all this stuff, but it's a ton of fun, and I've always been drawn to theater and music and the combination of theater and music. And I've also, like Mia said, I'm absolutely convinced that every art form, from songwriters at the open mic to opera at the opera house, not only can contribute to social consciousness raising and social justice issues, but in fact should. And it would be a shame if opera were not involved in those kinds of projects. So that's, I guess, my process and my thoughts about it.
And there's a minor line of thinking. I think you probably would not hear from these 2 songs is my activism, I guess, for women's issues. So this is Mrs. May. She has a daughter, and in the first act, the mother decided she's not going to have her feet bound. And so that's, and then there is a pair of right boots and the red robe. So she handed down to her daughter, basically, throughout the opera. So there's a subtlety in why Mrs. May decided American is a better place for her offsprings, for herself and as well as her daughter's sake. So that's why she was so distraught when her dream didn't come true and being so rudely interrupted. So that's another side of it. So woman and fate is also part of this opera. And I want to show women and children in the opera how they fare in this struggle for life at the Western frontier.
That, of course, is also, you know, as we all know, as we think about social justice issues, victims of oppression over here can quickly turn into oppressors over here, right? I mean, we're all sort of caught up in this web, and we're in a relationship, positive, negative, oppressor, victim, with people around us in all kinds of complex ways. And often we're, of course, not aware of that. That's the beauty of privilege, right? You just don't see what you don't want to see or what doesn't affect you. So in this opera, we're having literally every word, we're having to think, what does this mean? What does this character mean by this? What is this line? Where is this line going? What is this person thinking about when they're saying this? And often the music is providing a kind of a subtext. I often think that my music is saying things between the lines of her words. And so she and I go back and forth quite a bit. Sometimes I just say, you know, this phrase, yeah, too many words. or sometimes I'm just saying, you know, because English is your second language, right? And there are occasionally times when I say, do you actually mean that? Or do you mean this? But other times it's just like saying, for instance, I came back to you sometime during the summer and said, I think we need another female character in here, right? We've got all these men. We need another powerful female character here. And so we made up the wife of Ezra Meeker. Now, there was a real Mrs. Meeker, and we did some research on her. We don't know a lot about her, but we took what we could find and made her a strong pro-Chinese advocate. And in fact, she even takes her husband to task. I mean, he's out there at the Opera House trying to defend the Chinese, but she's basically saying, you're not trying hard enough. What's wrong with you guys? So another voice coming in from the side. I don't know what time we're supposed to finish. I'm thinking maybe we're close to the end. Anybody know? 5 minutes. Okay, thank you very much. Another final question or two. Yes?
So you had said that this all came out in the 90s, and I was in elementary and middle school during the 90s, and, you know, I think it was still pretty fresh. So we weren't taught this in history classes. How do we get this knowledge out to the younger generations that will be future leaders?
Well, while we're waiting for this opera, and we're going to be waiting a little while, that's what the Chinese Reconciliation Project Foundation is all about, just to bring the whole thing full circle. Their mission is to raise consciousness about not just that historical event, but to give Tacomans and other people a space down on the waterfront to learn. There's all kinds of signage down there. There's images. To reflect. There are tall standing stones, that some of which have carved images on them showing the Chinese population slowly fading away from Tacoma. There's a group of dangerous-looking black sort of railroad tie things standing up that represent the group of 27, the group of white sort of organizers of the mob. So that park is a place to go reflect and think. And then you also mentioned the Straw Hats, Sandals, and Steel book. That is being reissued by the foundation and should be out, I would guess, within 6 months or so. It took a lot of rewriting to do it because we wanted to honor that author's original voice, and yet there were some obvious errors. And so there's been an awful lot of conversation about what's appropriate and what's inappropriate to do with her work now that she's deceased. But that book is coming out. We're going to give away hundreds of copies to schools, libraries, things like that. And yeah, and we're always eager to bring people to the website to go, so because there's stuff that goes on. The Moon Festival that happens every September is in some ways all about that. It's a celebration of Tacoma's diverse community. We always have a stage full of performers. We've had Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese. We've had Hispanic, Mexican. We've even had. Who do we have? Croatians came. We're sort of a celebration of Tacoma's very, very multi-ethnic immigrant population over 100 and some years. And so that's a kind of a statement, not just an acknowledgement of past injustice, but a statement of Tacoma, we do not want to be that again, right? Tacoma is trying really hard to be something else now. The Tide Flats facility notwithstanding. I mean, that's kind of this thorn in the side in a way. But anyway, that's what the foundation's mission really is to try to get this out there more.
And I know some of you are school teachers or working for school board. Well, invite us. We'll go to your school to give a presentation, right? And I'm sure Josh and Mia is willing to sing if you can raise up the fund, right?
And I have a third song all ready to go, all ready to record. So Mia, I'm going to have to ask you to record again. And we'll get, and we would love to take a little, maybe a 3-song show. This was a 2-song show. Maybe take a 3-song show on the road. Go visit schools, go visit libraries, wherever we can get an audience. Yeah. Okay, you've been a fabulous audience. Thank you very much.